Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Traybold. I'm the department head and associate professor at the Golisano Institute for Sustainability at RIT. Welcome to today's webinar on innovation in sustainable energy, covering food waste and fuel cells. So before we get into the technical content, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the Golisano Institute for Sustainability. We are, by design, an interdisciplinary graduate program offering 3 degrees: a Master's of Science in Sustainable Systems, Master of Architecture, and a PhD in Sustainability. And we cover 4 primary research thrusts: sustainable energy, which is the focus of today's webinar, but also sustainable mobility, sustainable production, eco-IT, and I also wanted to mention that GIS houses the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute, which is a separate non-academic organization that I have collaborated a lot and collaborated with me on the research that will be discussed here today. I also just wanted to very briefly mention how I got here to GIS. I actually had spent about 20 years in industry before coming to RIT. I started off in the chemical engineering program at Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York. Finished my PhD in 1989 and then went to work at General Electric on primary coolant systems for nuclear submarines. From there, after about 9 years, I went to Xerox Corporation and worked on coating and drying processes for photoreceptors. After 3 years there, I ended up at the General Motors fuel cell vehicle program, and that kind of laid the foundation for some of the research I'm talking about today. And then in 2009, joined the group here in Golisano Institute of Sustainability, and have been here since, initially in a research faculty mode, and then I eventually moved over to the academic faculty a few years after arriving. So first, I just wanted to give a high-level overview of our 2 main research areas, and then dive into some of the details and try to identify where some of the compelling research questions are in these areas, and then also talk about what I view as the path forward in these 2 areas. As the title of the webinar implies, the 2 primary parts of my research program are on waste energy technologies and then also fuel cells. So in the waste to energy area, we really focus on 2 technologies. One is anaerobic digestion, which is a fairly common technology that converts organic matter in the absence of oxygen into methane-rich biogas, which can be put to productive use, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And our main focus of that work is on food waste utilization. And in some cases, we combine those food waste materials with dairy manure or things of that nature. In addition to anaerobic digestion, we also look at thermochemical conversion methods, namely pyrolysis, which is essentially heating material up, organic material up, in the absence of oxygen. And when processed at temperatures ranging from, say, 500 to 800 degrees centigrade, will convert organic matter into a hydrogen-rich syngas, and then a solid phase, which we refer to as biochar. And I'll get into some of the details of that and some of its applications a bit later. The second part of the research really focuses on fuel cell systems. The first focus area is in integrated high temperature proton exchange membrane fuel cells and fuel reformers with a specific focus on unmanned aerial vehicles, or otherwise known as drones. So in this area, we've used both propane and biogas as our primary feedstocks for hydrogen. And I'll explain how that works in detail in a little bit. The second area is in fuel reforming. So that is taking hydrocarbon fuels, which could include diesel, gasoline, biodiesel, bioethanol, biogas from anaerobic digesters, and converting that into hydrogen efficiently in order to be used in other types of fuel cell systems. In this case, we're talking about solid oxide fuel cells, which run nominally at 800 degrees centigrade and are suitable for stationary power generation. So in looking at these two seemingly disparate research thrust areas, what I would view as the holy grail is ultimately pulling those two research thrusts together. And that would mean we would run fuel cell systems that by nature are highly efficient, but derive the hydrogen used in those fuel cell systems from waste-based biofuels. So in my mind, if we can combine waste materials as our primary feedstock, convert them into biofuels, and then generate electricity from those fuels in fuel cells, that provides a pathway to ultra-low carbon energy generation, and I think has a lot of potential for future development. Now I just want to step back for a minute and talk about what's motivated our interest in food waste as a resource. As I'm sure you all know, the conventional way we deal with food waste is through landfills and wastewater treatment plants. And these are, in a sense, kind of absurd because we're taking material that has a high level of potential value and converting them or rendering them harmless by using fossil fuels. And in many cases, a lot of fossil fuels. So what we seek to figure out is how do we shift the paradigm in this industry to start thinking about food waste materials as actual resources, instead of treating those materials as something that has to be disposed of. How do we start to extract value from those materials? And looking at food waste broadly, it's a major problem, not only in the US, but globally. And this just gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. And this is from 2016 data showing the amount of food waste that's generated across the farm to fork spectrum. So everything from agriculture to actual consumption at the household level. And you can see that looking at agriculture, food processing, consumer-facing businesses and households, we're generating well in excess of 70 million tons of food waste a year just in the US. And the cost of that waste is really mind-boggling. By these estimates, it exceeds $200 billion a year. So even if we can start to address even a small part of this problem, there's huge potential in terms of cost savings, economic value to consumers, and just enormous reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are all achievable. So the question then is, if we're not going to send food waste to the landfill, what alternatives do we have? And this flow chart just gives you some idea of what we could potentially do. Once we understand and characterize the waste materials that are available, we could look at different pathways, including animal feed, composting, value-added products, including bioplastics, chemicals, fertilizers, and nutraceuticals. And then the last option is using those materials for renewable or sustainable energy. And that's, of course, where my research group focuses. So I mentioned anaerobic digestion and thermochemical conversion, which includes gasification, but we also have the option of converting high sugar and carbohydrate materials into alcohol via fermentation. Transesterification is another option, and that is the conversion of materials such as waste cooking oil into biodiesel or other hydrocarbon fuels. Then once you've converted the waste feedstock materials using one of these technologies, then the question is, well, what do you do with the co-products? So there's biofuels produced, including biomethane, bioethanol, biobutanol, and so forth. And then those can be utilized in things such as on-site electricity generation, transportation fuel. We can use them in fuel cells, of course, or even directly using them for space heating or steam generation. In most cases, there's also a solid co-product, things such as biochar, which I'll talk in a little bit more detail about later, animal bedding, fertilizer, and so forth. So there are a number of food waste utilization pathways that we have at our disposal. The question is, which of these pathways provides the best opportunity for sustainability, looking at not only economics and environmental benefits, but also considering the social aspects of these various systems. So just to mention some of the things that we've done with anaerobic digestion, we've modeled and analyzed so-called co-digestion operations, that is combining animal manure and food waste to understand what is the potential benefit in net greenhouse gas emissions. And we've determined in a recently published paper that we can achieve on the order of 70% reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions relative to conventional technologies, and that really comes from displacing grid electricity and inorganic fertilizers. So some of the remaining research questions in this area and what we're continuing to work on include, what do you do with the digestate? That is the effluent from the anaerobic digester, especially if you don't have the digester located on a farm and you don't have the ability to spread the effluent on the farm fields. The second big research question here is, what do we do with the biogas? We can generate a large amount of biogas, but which use of that gas is most sustainable? Should we use it for electricity generation? Should it be used in compressed natural gas vehicles? What about injecting it directly into the natural gas pipeline? These are all options which need to be considered and systematically evaluated. Another area in waste energy is biochar and syngas production via thermochemical conversion. So I mentioned previously that this involves converting biomass at temperatures in the range of 500 to 800 centigrade. In the absence of oxygen, we produce this hydrogen-rich syngas with a bio-oil, which is a relatively small fraction of the co-products, and then also a solid biochar material, which is essentially elemental carbon, or close to 100% elemental carbon, which is extremely stable and can be used to essentially sequester carbon, but also has beneficial uses in things like soil amendment. It can be used as an absorbing medium, and a variety of other applications that we're looking at. And that really leads to one of the primary research questions in this area, which is, what can you do with the biochar if it's not suitable as a soil amendment? Could you use it as an absorbing medium, as a replacement for, say, activated carbon? Could it be used in printing products? There's also potential applications in building materials. So those are all things that are being considered and evaluated from both economic and environmental standpoints. And then, similar to the anaerobic digestion case, what's the best use of the syngas? Here, that biogas has somewhat different composition because of the conversion process. This is not a methane-rich biofuel. It's actually a hydrogen-rich biofuel. So it's very well suited for fuel cells. So that leads us into the next part of the talk, and the second half of my research program, if you will, on high efficiency conversion with fuel cells. So fuel cells are a huge area of research, and just very briefly, what makes them so attractive is that they provide a direct conversion of chemical energy into electrical energy. There is no thermal energy production to drive a mechanical process as you would have in, say, an internal combustion vehicle. You have a proton conducting membrane which supports electrodes on an anode and cathode side. Hydrogen will enter on the anode side, be converted into hydrogen ions and electrons. The hydrogen ions can pass through the proton conducting membrane, but that material is electrically insulating. So the electrons have to instead flow around through the external circuit, and that's what creates the direct current. So because of this direct conversion of chemical to electrical energy, these systems provide much higher efficiencies than you can achieve with a conventional thermal process that might run at, say, 30 or 35% efficiency. Some fuel cell systems can achieve electrochemical efficiencies as high as 60%, and if we fully utilize the waste heat, we can achieve system efficiencies that approach 90%. So great potential with this technology relative to conventional conversion technologies. But the big question is, and this is what's kind of hampered the fuel cell vehicle industry, is where does the hydrogen come from? Hydrogen does not exist, or rarely exists, in nature in elemental form. It's usually combined in some other compound. So we need to identify a source of hydrogen. And for many applications, we need to identify a high density energy carrier. So one application that we're currently working on, and is an area of ongoing research, is in unmanned aerial vehicles, otherwise known as drones. These systems are currently somewhat hampered by short flight times and durability issues. So we are currently in the process of developing fuel cell systems that will utilize a high energy density fuel, in this case propane, convert that on in situ into hydrogen, and then use the hydrogen in a fuel cell system. So the research questions here that we're in the process of addressing are, firstly, can a propane reformer and a nominally 500-watt fuel cell system improve flight time and durability of battery-based UAVs? And secondly, the longer-term objective is replacing propane with biogas for mobile applications, because ultimately we want to get fossil-based hydrocarbon fuels completely out of the equation and move to renewable fuels such as biogas. So in light of the time constraint, I'm going to move through these last couple of slides quickly, but just to give you a sense for how we're working toward achieving sustainability by combining technologies. Oftentimes, just using one technology by itself will not achieve the environmental and economic sustainability targets that we need to achieve. And in many cases, economics is the more difficult objective to meet. So by combining different technologies, we can improve the overall system efficiency, and in many cases make the economics look much more favorable. So this is an example of one research project that we've worked on where we use food processing waste to generate biochar through a pyrolysis system, and then that biochar is used as an absorbent to filter essentially the liquid phase waste from that same food processing plant. And then that so-called enriched biochar, which now contains organic matter, can be used as a fertilizer. And we've run experiments with partners at Cornell University to show that that enriched biochar can increase the growth of tomato, lettuce, and basil plants. So that's one example where we're combining adsorption and pyrolysis to generate high-value products such as fertilizer. Another concept that I wanted to point out is the concept of a community biorefinery. So this is a situation where we would combine multiple feedstocks and using a biorefinery, which is akin to an oil refinery, generate a wide variety of different feedstocks. So in this example, we could, in principle, combine food processing waste, tree and lawn waste, residential food waste, and institutional food waste with existing systems such as wastewater treatment plants, combine them, convert them using some of the technologies I mentioned before, and generate a number of value-added co-products: methane, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium containing fertilizers, biomaterials, you name it. So there's a wide variety of co-products that could be generated. So in light of the limited time, I'm just going to go to the last slide here and quickly talk about path forward. And these are some of the highlights that are kind of pointing us to where we want to take this research in the future. First of all, food waste is a major global problem requiring new solutions that valorize or upcycle its embodied energy and water content. Anaerobic digestion, fermentation, biodiesel, thermochemical conversions, these are all going to play a role in this emerging food waste energy ecosystem. The fuels that are generated by these technologies can be viable sources of hydrogen for fuel cells. And as I said earlier, this combination of technologies offers a pathway to very high system efficiencies, much higher than what we can achieve with conventional systems. Going forward, though, you have to understand all the system flows, material flows, energy, water, and even information to optimize the environmental, economic, and social benefits. And lastly, I would just emphasize that technology can't do it all. Almost everything we do in GIS is in collaboration with people with different backgrounds, and we need to collaborate with not only engineers and scientists, but also lawyers, economists, policymakers, community leaders, and so forth. So with that, I'll end. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Okay, so we have a question here, and I'm going to put on my glasses so I can see what I'm reading. Have you discussed which species are presently viable for each of the alternative utilizations? Yeah, that's a good question. So we've done a lot of work with food waste. That's certainly been the focus of our research. And I would say mixed food waste, say post-consumer waste, is generally well suited for things like anaerobic digestion. However, there are waste materials such as food processing wastes, which tend to be more homogeneous and more consistent in their properties. And in many cases, those materials are better suited for things like, say, dehydration, which can be used to generate a secondary food product, which would have higher value than using those materials in anaerobic digestion or other energy conversion systems. Other than food waste, we've actually looked at a lot of other types of organic matter. One good example is we've been looking at waste cardboard and paper as a feedstock for biochar production. And then once we have that biochar, that can be used in a wide variety of applications. We've used biochar in printing products. We've used biochar as a replacement for activated carbon in building materials, things like roofing tiles or sustainable concrete. So there's really a wide variety of materials that can be used. And generally speaking, organic material across the board, whether it's food waste or paper waste or say even lawn and tree waste, those things can all be converted with the methods we're talking about today. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some of the additional questions. Someone asked about acquiring more information about this ongoing research. I would absolutely be happy to share publications and other presentations, or talk by phone. You can contact me there at the email address shown here, or feel free to call me. Again, I'm happy to share any of those details with you and provide publications. Another question asks about the variety of different feedstocks for biorefining, preferable to a uniform input. How sensitive is biorefining efficiency to fuel inputs? That's actually an important consideration, and a lot of the research that my current and recently graduated students have focused on is the relationship between food waste properties and, say, the amount of biogas they can generate. It does vary quite a bit. Say things such as bakery waste or baked goods tend to generate a relatively high level of biomethane, say in the case of anaerobic digestion, whereas things like vegetable waste tend to produce less biogas. The key is in figuring out how to blend materials to maximize the amount of biogas produced, but also maintain system stability. Several of the parameters you really have to pay attention to are pH. You can't let the pH drop too far out of a fairly narrow range, or the system could go unstable. So you have to kind of systematically blend waste materials together to maintain stability. And the challenge is that a lot of these materials are not constant over time. So you have to pay attention to temporal variations in feedstocks that are generated. That's the reason why many of the systems that are in operation now are co-digestion plants, where you might have 30 or 40% food waste blended with dairy manure, which is very homogeneous and very consistent. So by doing that, you can help maintain system stability and still maximize the rate of biogas produced.